help achieve your business goals. It is an incredibly crowded market for digital content. By 2025, the world will be producing 175 trillion gigabytes of data. So there's a lot of competition for the mindshare of busy business audiences, and it can be hard to know where to begin in finding a story to capture their imagination. But don't worry, because we're going to look at how to create B2B narratives that will make you stand out. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 guests with particular expertise in this field. As Global Content Strategist at EY, Liz Bolshaw leads the editorial strategy for the firm's thought leadership. With experience as a senior analyst running major research initiatives, she also has an extensive editorial background that includes 8 years as a lead writer at the Financial Times and a successful career in book and magazine publishing. We also have with us Laura Sheridan Powers, Director of Integrated Communications at the M&A fintech Datasite. Laura has honed her communication skills in senior roles at EY, KPMG, and HSBC, having begun her career as a reporter for Bloomberg. She holds a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. And finally, Mike Zimmerman, Head of Content Marketing and Editorial Development at Hitachi Digital. Mike has covered tech stories for over 25 years, from his early days as a journalist for titles like PC Week to serving as managing editor for IBM's corporate blog, and more recently establishing a thought leadership hub for Hitachi. Welcome all of you. I'm looking forward to a really engaging conversation. And for our audience, if you have any questions during our discussion, please enter them in the questions box at the side of your screen, and we'll try to answer them at the end of our chat. So let's dive in. Firstly, given the volume of content out there, how do you go about finding a unique topic for your audience? Mike, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to do this. One of the ways that's been most effective for me and my teams has been to identify, and then establish a roster of subject matter experts, and then meet with them regularly. It may not be because there's an announcement coming down the road. It may not be because they've got an event, but it's a touch base. And when you have these regular meetings and get-togethers with the subject matter experts, that's when you start to be able to understand, what they're thinking, what's important to them, and then you can story mine. And story mining is, you go into the conversation. You may go into the conversation with one story in mind, but something comes in from the side, an idea pops up, and you must be willing and ready to pounce on a new idea. And so these are the kinds of things that have worked well for me and my teams over the years.
Great. And I mean, it might be tempting for a lot of people, of course, to just follow the trends that everyone else is talking about. I'm wondering how we can avoid this and play to your company's strengths. Liz, if you could perhaps speak to that.
Yes, thanks, Katharine. So my view, I think the danger is that everybody wants to go wide on topics, that they feel that then they will be relevant to the biggest audiences. In my experience, actually going narrow is a much better way of doing it. So think of something specialist that your particular firm or organization is already pretty good at doing, and make sure you go deep into that. I think the other way is to have a very intentional forward editorial calendar. So you have a distinct plan, you know what your priorities are, and you can focus on them. You can do bigger, bolder pieces of work rather than a sort of scattergun approach. So those are the 2 things I would recommend.
That's great. And obviously, as part of this session, we're talking about the role of data in storytelling as well. Laura, I wonder if you could talk about the role that original research can play in coming up with some of those ideas for thought leadership.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to. I think original research is hugely important, right? Because it helps establish your brand, but also creates a really powerful story about what the data is telling or saying. And I think, a small thing that I think about sometimes is, in the word news, the first 3 letters are new. So in order to have something that's really compelling, it's got to be interesting and new and takes some of its points from maybe what's going on in the world, and uses the research and the data to really sort of come up with a great story or a great narrative, plugging in kind of the data to fit, well, not to fit, but to help tell a great story.
Do you have an example perhaps that you'd like to share of research work you've undertaken that has led to a feature piece?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, we at Datasite have done a couple of different research projects. Essentially, we're always interested in understanding what deal makers are thinking, feeling, and doing, right? So that we can best guess where, sort of the market is headed, where they might, be investing, that sort of thing. And I think it's kind of interesting to other deal makers, right, to hear that sort of information. So one project that we're working on actually at the moment is thinking about how the elections, I think 40% of the world is going to the polls this year, and how that might impact markets, but also particularly for us, mergers and acquisition activity.
That's great. And of course, obviously, talking about storytelling content, in particular, the ideation of content, we can't avoid the elephant in the room, which is AI. I'm wondering how much each of you are using generative AI for ideation and even perhaps content generation. Where is it useful and what are its limitations? Liz, if we could start with you on that.
Yes, sure. So we use it quite a bit for a sort of shortcut to some of the desk research we might do, whether we're establishing white space, whether we're trying to make sure that we're capturing all the data we have, because we do an awful lot of original research every year. We're probably commissioning about I would say about 60 new surveys every year, which is quite substantial. So we have an enormous data bank, and AI is really, really good so long as you get your prompt well at interrogating large data sets and coming up with something that's usable. We don't use it yet to generate thought leadership. We've sometimes put it through. We have our own kind of version of ChatGPT, and we have experimented with it doing thought leadership. We don't think it's got quite what we need yet, but I'm not saying never. I think every iteration is clearly a step forward.
Yeah, if I
Great.
could
Laura, how
pile.
about you? Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I was just going to say that we're in the same position at Hitachi Digital. So we're a digital transformation company, so we're helping companies, adopt things like generative AI and cloud and analytics and things like that. So we want to sip our own champagne and delve into things like Gen AI tools. So, but we're using it for, I think you were alluding to this, Liz. So we're using it for draft um, ideation initially. At some point, as our prompt work gets better, we may advance that from draft to something else. But right now we're using it to just get things started, whether it's a social post or a web content or a blog or something like that. But also I was going to mention, and I don't know, Laura, if you and Liz agree with this, but so we're in the process also of setting up guidelines because we need to understand who's doing what with these tools, what tools are they uh, playing with, and then simple things like that you may not think about, like have a disclaimer, get ready to have a disclaimer on any content where you use ChatGPT or Jasper or any of the other tools. Something simple like AI was used in the creation of this blog, something like that. Those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about.
Yeah,
Laura,
Mike.
perhaps, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, AI is creating a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges, right? On the one hand, it can free up some time, right? And as you and Liz have both said, it's kind of a nice, great idea starter or blog starter or social media kind of post starter. But and I think from a marketing perspective, it certainly can help companies focus on deeper personalization and account-based insights. But on the other hand, as you've mentioned, it really does pose a lot of risks, including privacy, intellectual property, security, and data quality to your company and to your brand. So you need to be very, thoughtful and careful about, what data you're actually using. As you've said, we actually do have some policies in place already in terms of how we're letting employees know how we expect them to use AI or use ChatGPT or some of there's an awful lot of free available tools. But as you've said, I think it's super important to be clear about, where this content is coming from and how it was created. We, as a little aside, we, do a lot of work around mergers and acquisitions, and one of the things that, interestingly, we've turned to AI at some point to kind of help create a checklist for people who are putting their work into a data room and what should be included there. But we've also said that we helped create this with the benefit of ChatGPT. It's a kind of a, recognition, right? That we certainly have the expertise to help you with a checklist, but we also are bringing in some other data that, or information that might be useful. But
I guess there's also
have to say where it's been created and how it was created, and we certainly
definitely.
acknowledge that.
Yeah, I guess there's also the issue, obviously, of trust in brands, because there's, AI is still very prone to hallucinations, and making sure that, factual accuracy is central to the content that you're producing.
Yeah, I mean, I think organizations should only engage, with trusted partners and to maximize the impact and make sure that there is a lot of security around it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And of course, once you've found your idea, you need to create that story that goes around it. With today's short attention spans, you really need to hook an audience pretty quickly. So I'm wondering, what does great storytelling look like, Liz?
So obviously this is the central question to this whole webinar, and I don't suppose it's easy to answer in one go. But one thing I think people tend to do is to feel the need to paint a big picture of the current climate. So every thought leadership piece that I kind of start with is always, we are living in unprecedented times of turbulence, accelerated technological change. And, actually, ditch that. Everybody knows that. I think the danger is you want to wait for the rabbit to come out of the hat at the end. I would say start with the rabbit. So the first thing is, what is the most surprising thing that has come out of your work on this particular topic? It might be, a quote from one of your clients. It might be a data point that's come out of the research you've done. But really focus in on the really surprising thing first, and then build a story around it. And, in terms of storytelling, as we all know, keep it personal, have real examples, make sure there's a strong narrative flow. Don't just dump data on the page where you say, 67% of people thought this, 73% said that. It doesn't make any difference. Be quite disciplined. Sometimes there will be data points that don't build into the story, and you should be happy to leave them on the cutting room floor. So I think a lot of it is about starting with a bang and making sure you really, really focus in on the big thing, and then building ideally quite a sharp story that keeps your audience really with you all the way.
And Laura, obviously, like the rest of the panel, you come from a media background. How can marketers lean into journalistic skills to create a really strong story?
Yeah, I mean, to Liz's point, I think you need to be sort of curious, right? And when you've got a set of data or research that you've done, I think it also doesn't hurt, back to Mike's point, is to run it by your subject matter experts. What do they think is the most interesting bit of what you've secured? If there's, and it could be that there might, not be something so surprising, but what is it? Usually there is some kernel of information that's going to be a bit of a pop. And I think, in terms of leading with that, that is what you want to. So don't feel like you have to do it all by yourself. I think that, bringing in, you will have already, one of the things that we do is make sure that the research that we're doing is will work for the rest of the company, whether that's by running it by a couple of subject matter experts, making sure that other partners in the company are comfortable with what we're doing as well, and that it will be useful to them and to our clients. Really, that's kind of the bottom line. But I do think that having sort of a small, as Liz said, focusing in on something kind of quite surprising or unusual, and then sort of, using quotes either from clients or even from your own experts, right, to sort of explain why this is unusual, and then to, broaden it out and say, kind of, how is this going to affect your particular industry or people in this field, or what does this mean for the larger for a larger audience even. That's
Yeah,
how I
if I
approach
could
it.
if I could pile onto that too.
Please, Mike.
So I agree with both Liz and Laura, and so what I was starting to bring up earlier about story mining. I've talked to folks in the past about this idea of, if it's interesting to you, it's probably going to be interesting to somebody else. You can go about it in a very formal fashion and do your uh, your follow the rules and put together a story that someone wants you to put together. But the most interesting stories they come in from the side. I was just talking to senior technologist about a week ago, and we went into the conversation to talk about a story idea on this new innovation. Well, it was okay. We're going through the motions. Okay, this is what it is. This is what it does. This is the challenge it's going to solve. Um, but it was pretty rote for my taste. It was pretty formulaic. Like, yeah, this is the beginning, middle, and end. Okay, fine. Um, but then he said, well, because Mike, it's really expensive to move data around. So when you're talking about Gen AI, and you're talking about training data, it gets really expensive. And he said, most people don't think about that. And I said, hold up, hold up. So we're talking about the cost of Gen AI. We're talking about the cost of analytics. And he said, yeah, exactly. So that's what, just to tease the story that's going to be coming down the pike in a couple of weeks, that's going to be the story. So if it's interesting to you, it's probably going to be interesting to other people. And now those are the things that Laura's talking about, to, like, look for that idea that you may not be thinking about, but it comes in the conversation, comes up in the conversation. And just one other point, you know, we live in a different world today than we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, from a writing standpoint. We got 15 seconds to grab someone's attention on a website. 15 seconds. On LinkedIn, 3 seconds. 3 seconds. So you have to be different. You have to be compelling. You have to present the story in the most compelling, attractive way you can, quickly. And so, totally agree with Liz with the idea that Do not, you have to abandon any idea of using trite, rote leads to your stories. You have to get into the meat of it right away. Kind of a long
And I
answer.
guess you also have to consider the right format for the story, right? I mean, it's, is this one a blog? Is it better just as a social video? What's the kind of process that you go through, Mike, to determine that?
You look at every story from that lens. We've got 5 or 6 channels, and with every single story, we're thinking, okay, does this make a better blog? Does this make a better thought leadership piece? Does it make a better LinkedIn article, which is what we're starting to do more of these days, because LinkedIn, whether we like it or not, it is a communications channel. It's a media channel, and with our own controlled circulation, folks follow us and they follow all of us. And so with that audience, you've got an opportunity to share your story and then monitor and analyze the demographics and the timing and all that. So every single story goes through that filter. Where's the best place to put it? And sometimes it's all of the above. Okay, how can we, let's dress it up for LinkedIn. Let's dress it up for Facebook. Let's put a different spin on it for Facebook. Let's see if we can get a short video clip or an audio clip of the author, or the subject matter expert. So yeah, it goes through that filter because
And how much of
amplification
a
is huge.
challenge is,
Amplification is huge. Sorry.
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say, how much of a challenge is it? You need to produce things obviously slightly differently. Even if it's the same story, it needs to be adapted depending on format and platform. How much of a consideration is that, perhaps looking at, the resourcing in your team or the capabilities when you're putting content together? Laura, do you want
Uh,
to take that one?
oh, sure.
Or Mike, please.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
first.
No, I mean, I'm happy to chime in. I think absolutely. I mean, as we've talked about sort of research or data points, I think I always think about, well, yes, how can I write about this or create a blog or a contributed article or something like that. But also, those data points can be really fun, not fun, but super informative. You can create an infographic out of a set of data points that's easily digestible. You can make it interactive. We've just started to do that a bit more with some of our content online. You can have GIFs and animated GIFs that you might use in social, on LinkedIn and elsewhere. As Mike said, you can have a video of, maybe it's a short interview or, 2 minutes from an interview that somebody gave already. To talk about this, one of your subject matter experts, for example. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it does take resources. So I would say all of this definitely is time intensive. And, some things you'll be able to get done more quickly than others, but some of the content, is quite useful for, 6 months. You can plan it out over time as well. And I think that's sort of a nice way, especially if you've got a big research project or something like that. You can really use it in many different ways.
I guess this all ties into the way that audiences are consuming stories differently as well. I think you alluded to that earlier, Mike. It's got to be quick, it's got to be, grabbing them straight away. How much more accessible do we think content needs to be? I mean, what do you think about when you're putting it together for perhaps younger audiences or mobile first audiences, for instance, Laura?
Yeah, that is absolutely a thing that we think about a lot. Much of our audience are M&A professionals who are completely time crunched all the time. So trying to get their attention, we definitely need to have things that are available to them on mobile. I think we've done things that are a bit different on our Instagram channel. We've made things that you can see a different sort of thing slightly on mobile than you might be on our website, obviously. I even, obviously from a product perspective, we have incorporated the ability that people can manage things on our platform if they're using our platform from a mobile device. That's been a huge thing. I mean, I think the idea of being able to manage anything from anywhere at any time is something that we always think about.
I want to, speaking of busyness levels, Liz, I'd like to get into cadence as well. How much and how often should companies be publishing? I know perhaps a number of marketers feel that volume play is the right way to go, but that's not necessarily the best approach.
No, I mean, I think before we get to cadence, I'd just like to say something building on something Laura said about different formats. We've started experimenting with this idea of interactivity. So we've got an AI maturity index that we've been building. And we've obviously done some research with a whole load of companies and executives, but we've also got an online version where you can put your own data in. You can answer some fairly simple questions. It takes about 10 minutes, I think. And that then is becoming an ever increasingly rich data source, because we're able then to build that back into the index. So I think there are really exciting things you can do. And interactivity hasn't, to be fair, been a hallmark of thought leadership. I think we've always sort of rather told it from the top. And I think given digital tools that are certainly really helping this, but also given a younger generation, I think building in some form of interacting with your content is going to be really important, and it keeps people excited. So back to cadence. There is a danger that you feel, I mean, one thing we hear a lot of from people is we want to be part, we haven't got anything particularly new to say, but we just want to be in the conversation. And I tend to challenge that quite a bit. I think actually just being in the conversation isn't good enough if you haven't got something interesting to say. And I think on the whole, if you have limited resources, and certainly we know that our audiences have very limited time, you need to be quite selective about how much you're going to push at them and how often. And I would always say it's better to go bigger and bolder if you have those limited resources than sort of doing lots and lots and lots of little things that don't necessarily add up to very much. Certainly be very selective in terms of channels, and we are, just as building on what Mike was saying, I mean, we use LinkedIn in a huge amount, and we also use it to build audiences back into our website. So, you can do something on LinkedIn which might be, a little carousel of animated infographics, works really well, a little bit of visual storytelling through data, and then at the end there's a link to a much bigger report, and that's a great way of doing things. But I would say always don't just feel you have to keep pushing stuff down a pipe. I think that's a mistake, personally.
Just to follow up on that, Liz, how do you manage that within an organisation, because there quite often is a clamour from various stakeholders to publish a range of stories, whatever they have to be working on at the time, for instance. How do you kind of corral that into shape?
Well, we have quite a strong, at EY, which is strange because we're obviously a partnership and we're a big four firm, so an awful lot of people with very big egos who think they know best. But the fact is we've developed a central governance model, which for our global thought leadership, it doesn't operate at country level. And we're pretty intentional. So, we establish editorial priorities at the beginning of each financial year. And we have kind of big campaigns that sit under that. And then within that, we will have a thought leadership editorial calendar that we develop. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't pieces that come through that aren't in that, master plan, because inevitably that happens. But we've gone from publishing, I've been in this role for about 2 and a bit years. And when I arrived, we were publishing about nearly 700 pieces of global thought leadership a year, and we've reduced that down to under 200 in 2 years, which is a fairly substantive reduction. And with that reduction, we've seen a massive increase in engagement and views. So I would say the proof is in the pudding. The data is there, and it's highly supportive of that way of doing it.
What was the impetus for cutting it down then dramatically?
I think it was mainly quality, because there was a big issue with quality. So we were finding that whether it was our source ranking or other things, the quality of what we did was very patchy. We were always doing some pieces really well, but not everything.
Well, have you found
we've now gone right up the ranking as a result of that decision?
Oh, interesting. Well, have you found that, a lot of times, or at least it's not uncommon for the squeaky wheel to get the grease? Like, so for example, you may have a group of people in a large organization, and they all think they've got the best story and they've got the best idea, and they're the ones who are going to get the bylines.
There's always
they may not be the best thought, but they may not be the best thought leadership people.
No, and I think the other thing that a lot of organisations struggle with is hierarchies. So, you find that the most senior people are the people who want to put their names to thought leadership, whereas actually the brains may be further down in the organisation. And we've done quite a big job of sort of co-creation. So we've got a really bright spark who may have joined the firm, just maybe in his 20s, and working with a senior partner to do something to make sure that we get that fresh stream of ideas through. It's not always easy, but there are ways of doing it, and I think it's really important when you can show people the evidence that it's actually working. In other words, you can see better engagement, better views, better overall impact. Then, if you're working for an accounting firm, then it's very difficult for people not to recognise that that's the worst. But it is a challenge, and sometimes it's hard because you're serving the organisation.
Right.
We, all of us in terms of content specialists, are serving a wider remit. But at the same time, I would say that we are experts in what we do, and we have to stand up for that bit of expertise and say, look, honestly, I've been doing this a while. This is a good way of doing it.
Right.
But yeah.
And Liz, do you find that? I was just going to say, do you find then? I assume that quality has improved and the content has been much more focused.
Yeah.
Given that narrowing of
Yeah. I mean, the quality thing was great because we so the source ranking, that they used to do twice a year, and then reducing it to just once a year. We've never been as highly ranked as we were the last time they did it, and I think that is a direct result, partly of putting more effort into quality, but also just the reduction of volume, being able to focus on fewer pieces. So I think quality is it's a bit intangible, but it's something we should all strive for.
I agree. I just want to add on a bit. I think also we've done a similar kind of process, Liz, where we've focused really pretty narrowly on a couple of different topics or projects per year. And in fact, our results have increased as well. I mean, we relentlessly track how many people have downloaded a report or an asset from our website, but also what does that mean then to the customer experience and journey and consideration and purchase decisions. And we regularly meet on those sort of metrics. And it's been hugely informative in terms of determining what works best and what do our customers actually want. And then, therefore, what do our targets want as well. So I think that is something that you always need to keep in mind, or let the analytics help inform, what you're doing.
That's right. There always has to be the rationale, the why, doesn't there? Mike, on the subject of doing more with less, and obviously bearing in mind the appetites of millennials and Gen Z buyers wanting more digestible content, is there a kind of sweet spot of length of story when you're looking at your content planning?
Yeah, definitely. And we've got loose guidelines. We have found that our sweet spot is between 600 and 800 words for a blog, thought leadership piece. Um, but that doesn't mean we cut it off at 800 words. I mean, we'll go 1,000, maybe 1,100. But um, writing short, whether it's we call it 600, 800 words or short stories, writing that shorter narrative really forces your hand from a writing perspective. It's not unlike, the short stories from, writers of the past that used to talk about this. You have to be deliberate, as Liz mentioned earlier. You have to focus on what's important, and you have to put it in a way that, has a beginning, middle, and an end that is unique and interesting. But you also have to think of the, as we talked about earlier, the channels. So a lot of our viewers are viewing our content on mobile phones. And so, a 2,000 word white paper is not going to be read, we don't think anyway, on an iPhone. Even an 800 word blog, maybe they'll get through half of it. I don't know. Maybe they'll read the whole thing. But we have to be cognizant of the platform as well as the story when we're building the story. So 600, 800 words is the sweet spot that we've found.
Do you have any guidance, any of you, for the best way to approach storytelling, perhaps in a more visual format? Because obviously you've got less words to play with in a video or a slideshow, for instance. What's the kind of knack to distilling that story into that format? Liz, if we could start with you on that.
I think the same principles apply to storytelling with data and infographics as they do to verbal storytelling. So you still need to have a strong hook up front, strong data point perhaps, a strong visual. I don't know whether everybody's seen it because it's quite old now, it's at least a year old, but the New York Times about a year ago did a little bit of, it was a sort of video animation that showed the number of plastic water bottles that were discarded in Manhattan in real time. So you start off with a bottle, and then you start with a little guy next to a kind of dump truck, and these bottles, there's a ticker at the top which is showing the numbers, and this bottle gets flooded into a massive, great mountain of plastic as you watch within about 2 minutes. It's absolutely brilliant. You don't need any words with it. It's completely obvious the story it's telling, and it's visually, I would say, does a much better job than if you'd written that out as a story. So there are ways of doing it. It's quite an expensive business doing that sort of animated video. New York Times TCJ is really famous, always wins loads of awards for this. But it's just an example that you can search it online. Example that I would say is a really good one of, can you tell a story without words? And the answer is absolutely you can. And with data too, there are lots of examples, great examples of data storytelling. But they require the same discipline. You still have to think, what is the main insight I'm trying to get across? What's the big hook? And can I land it in a logical way? And I think those basic principles apply to all narratives, however you do them.
Mike or Laura, do you have any other visual examples that you've seen as notable that you'd like to walk us through? Obviously, particularly in newspaper world, it's aside from the scrolly telling at the New York Times, a lot of media titles now are even bringing in data storytelling reporters or editors. How is that translated into great marketing content for B2B audiences?
Well, I can jump in, Laura, for a second. Going back to what I was talking about earlier, these days, if you want your story read, it starts with the image. It starts with the graphic. whether that's, I don't know, I'm not necessarily an infographic, but it starts with the image because you have to grab that person's attention who's scrolling down at 100 miles an hour, scrolling down their page, scrolling down their LinkedIn feed, or they go to your company's website, and there may be 20 things on that website, and you got 15 seconds to grab their attention. So the first thing on your great story has to be the image. Second thing is got to be the headline. It's got to be pithy. It's got to be short. Because if you don't have those two things, the best story in the world is not going to get read or read by a lot of people. And so we were talking about earlier about resources. These days, the B2B writer, the thought leadership writer has got to be nimble. They've got to, you know, once they get that story done, or as they're putting the story together, they're thinking of the imagery. They're thinking of the headline. They may have started with the headline. Um, and so that package, that story becomes a package. And I think of, just as an example, I worked on a story with a great guy, our CTO emeritus last year on a story that he wanted to do on direct air capture. This is these massive, like the HVAC systems that you see on rooftops to help ventilate buildings. Well, they've got, imagine those things the size of a house or two homes. And they suck carbon out of the air and they capture it and they store it. And so he did this piece, and the headline I wrote was, this giant sucking sound is good for the planet, is actually good for the planet, playing on this old comment from a political figure here in the U.S., Ross Perot, back in the 90s. Like, this giant sucking sound is good for the planet. And then I had an image of New York City, the New York City skyline, hazy skyline, yellowish sky, not foggy, but just haze with the pollution. And that story did extremely well. In fact, if you Google that, that's the first story that comes up still, and that was more than a year ago. Anyway, quick example.
Laura, how about you? Do you have an example that you'd like to share?
I don't know that I have an example of visual storytelling, but I guess I do think in terms of being able to produce something that will be of interest to people. I think these are sort of basic tenets, but you need to consider who your audience is. Who are you trying to reach with this story? I think, in the example Liz gave, that's a terrific example, and it applies to everyone, right? Because we're all consumers. Some of what I do is definitely not going to be interesting to every consumer. That is for sure. So I really need to understand who my audience is and what I want them to do. And I think, and why it's important, right? So contextualize why you're providing this information in the first place, and what and then kind of finally, what is it that you want to inspire them to do. It may be look around more on our website, or it could be hey, consider us as a partner. Those are the sorts of things. I think probably for a lot of what I do, or my team does, it's sort of in that consideration phase, and not necessarily further down the funnel where they're actually going to make a purchase. But having the answers to things that they're interested in is a big part of it, and just understanding what kind of information they might most want to know. We do focus sort of narrowly on a particular group of professionals, and that helps you in some ways to kind of keep it pretty tight, and make sure that this will be relevant to them, and that they'll want to come back and oh, what are they saying again, and where are they on this topic, or that sort of thing.
We have had an audience question come in, which I think is an important one to touch on. Obviously, we've talked about the ideas, the producing a piece, but within a large organization in particular, there will typically be a multi-stage approval process. How do who is kind of responsible for you in the final direction of a piece, and how do you keep all those stakeholders happy during the content creation process? Liz, let's go to you first on that.
Yes, so we definitely have this as a challenge and an issue. I think there's slightly different things. I think in terms of getting input from SMEs and a wide group of stakeholders, I really strongly recommend a kind of funnel approach. So you start wide, you get a lot of input at the beginning of a project, and you narrow it down, and ideally, if you possibly can, you have a single stakeholder or possibly two who fundamentally at the end signs something off and takes ownership and responsibility for it. What I've seen happen in a lot of places is the other way around, where you start talking to a single person, and then as the project progresses, the number of reviewers grows, and you're at a sort of final draft with, I have seen drafts with about 5 times the number of words in marginal comment than was in the original piece. And that is horrendous for anybody to manage. So I think a lot of it is stakeholder management and expectation management. And I think, if you need to have a lot of people involved, then do it early and then make it clear that you're going to listen and you're going to change things. And then you are going to be narrowing it down to 1 or 2 people who will maybe have their names on it or certainly will be responsible in the end for signing it off for your organisation.
Mike, do you have similar challenges? And if so, how do you deal with them?
Oh, absolutely, and I can't agree more with Liz. The challenge is that there's editorial obligation. If you're going to give a story to 5 people, you're going to get 5 edits back. That's just the nature of the beast. And so I have counseled colleagues over the years when I see when I'm CC'd on a story that's gone back to the SME and somehow 5 people have been added to the distribution list. And I've got them on the phone or emailed and said, why did you expand the distribution list? You're going to get 6 rounds of edits now because there's this, this obligation, this feeling of, well, I need to contribute something that was sent to me. So I need to review it. I need to give them my feedback. And it's a distraction, and it can slow the process down dramatically. So I've always limited to, like Liz said, I've always, you start wide and you go narrow and you say, okay, this is the person that needs. It's like need to know, nice to know. It's nice to share it with everybody so that they're all aware, but you can do the awareness thing after the thing posts. You can do the awareness thing after it's published. But for the review, you have to identify, okay, I need this person's buy-in, maybe that person's buy-in, and that's what I do.
And how about you, Laura? What's your process?
Yeah, I think similarly, keep it to sort of a tight group as you're about to publish. We're starting a project at the moment, and I am trying to go pretty wide on it so that I get everybody's input. I definitely want people's input on this project and want their feedback, but eventually I will circulate this just to a few people at the end of it, who will, give the final approval, if you will. I think it's important to socialize ideas, for sure, and to get buy-in from your stakeholders on something. Especially if it's a bigger project, and a brand building project. But I think that, in the end, you kind of have to rely on 1 or 2 champions to sort of be in it with you and fully committed to it. I think it's probably a little bit different when you're working at a smaller organization than a larger organization, for sure. It's not, possibly nearly as time consuming, and I've sort of had the benefit of doing both. And that is, the sort of the nice thing about working maybe at a smaller organization is that you can do things, quickly. You can have conversations with people, and it's just a bit different. But when you're scaling that, it changes. So for sure.
If I could add something too to this, because there's an intangible aspect to the storytelling that we're talking about, which is relationship management. It goes from like the squeaky wheel that I mentioned earlier. I hardly ever say no to somebody, for example, because I don't want to quash the energy that the person has for telling a story. So I almost always say, well, that's that's an interesting idea, but let's take it in this direction. Or from a review process, it's not uncommon for, when you send it to the one or two people for the review and then a post, it's not uncommon for several other people to chime in afterwards to say, why didn't I get a chance to review this? And so you've got to really, you've got to be sensitive and empathetic about the stakeholders and the SMEs that you're working with to tell their story most effectively and continually. So these are not one and done type of operations. So you have to work with all these folks, and so relationship management is a big part of storytelling. At least that I've found that
Absolutely.
to be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm mindful that we're nearing the end of our session here, and I wanted to give our audience a key takeaway to leave us with today. So I wanted to ask each of you in turn if there was one thing that our audiences could do today to improve their storytelling. What do you think that might be? Start with you, Liz.
Okay, I think if it's one thing, I would say simplify, make the complex simple. I think thought leadership is often difficult. We're often dealing with really complex topics, and I think the art is to simplify. Whether it's simplify in terms of headlines, my favourite headline, by the way, is "Headless Torso Found in Topless Bar." That is a wonderful headline. It's not one we can use with thought leadership, but I'll give it to you anyway. But another very good one was "Is Google Making Us Stupid?", which many of you I think will have read, which was talking about the sort of attention deficit disorder of young people being unable to read War and Peace anymore. But I think that that idea of having a complex topic that everybody knows is difficult, and our job is to try to simplify it into a really succinct message. I think that would be my one piece of advice.
Mike, how about you?
It would be, there's several, but if I have to give one, it would be deliberate, and that's be deliberate with story management, language, word choice, economy of words, and an angle, and that would be it. Be deliberate.
And
Uh,
Laura.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Liz. Simplify, but since we've already said that one, I'll think of something else. I think, what is it that you want people to come away with after they've seen something that you've produced, or, that whether it's a visual, a story, what is it that you want them to know, and to recall and to retain? And what is the action potentially that you want them to take from after reading your story or seeing your infographic or your other visual information? Could be a lot of different things, but be specific about what you want them to do. Or when you're thinking of the story as well at the end, what is it that you hope they get from this and that they do?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm afraid that is all we've got time for with this session. It's been a great and wide-ranging conversation, and I wanted to thank Liz, Laura and Mike for sharing some brilliant insights on B2B storytelling. Thanks also to our attendees for joining us. We'll send you a link to the replay. Of course, we're happy to answer any other questions that we might not have got to today, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. Goodbye for now.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Catherine. See you, folks.
Thanks.